One would think that France was already familiar territory for Graham Robb, as evident by his much acclaimed biographies on Hugo and Balzac, to name just a couple. It turns out when he took to his bike and began traveling the French countryside, that a much more richer history began to reveal itself to him. He reveals a history in his newest book, The Discovery of France. A recent New York Times review gave the flattering comment, "Mr. Robb has accomplished quite a feat. He has reintroduced France to itself," end quote. Robb's writing is fascinating and revealing, a delight for those who love to travel and love to learn about places. You may not realize it, but once you begin the discovery of France, you'll soon be dreaming about taking your own cycling tour through Europe. We are lucky that Graham Robb has captured this in his book, and we are lucky to have him speaking here today. Join me in welcoming Graham Robb.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for the tour. It's very impressive. And you'll have, is the sound okay? I'm British, I'm soft-spoken. So you can. Should I be giving such a low-tech talk at Google? Well, yes, because I'm been writing about France in or what seems to be a very low-tech period of its development. This is a history book, but it's also a kind of guidebook, which grew out of cycling trips through France, which I think is probably the best country in the world to cycle in. Once or twice a year, this is from the introduction, once or twice a year I travel through France with the dedicatee of this book, who is Margaret, my wife, who's American, at the speed of a 19th century stagecoach. Cycling not only makes it possible to conduct exhaustive research into local produce, it also creates an enormous appetite for information. Certain configurations of field, road, weather, and smell imprint themselves on the cycling brain with inexplicable clarity and return sometimes years later to pose their nebulous questions. A bicycle unrolls a 360-degree panorama of the land, allows the rider to register its gradual changes in gear ratios and muscle tension, and makes it hard to miss a single inch of it, from the tire-lacerating suburbs of Paris to the Mistral-blasted plains of Provence. The itinerary of a cyclist recreates, as if by chance, much older journeys, transhumance trails, Gallo-Roman trade routes, pilgrim paths, river confluences that have disappeared in industrial wasteland, valleys and ridge roads that used to be busy with peddlers and migrants. Cycling also makes conversation easy and inevitable, with children, nomads, people who are lost, local amateur historians, and of course dogs, whose behavior collectively characterizes the outlook of certain regions as clearly as human behavior once did. Each journey became a complex puzzle in 4 dimensions. I wanted to know what I was missing and what I would have seen a century or two before. At first, the solution, this was about 10 years ago, so once again it was a very low-tech solution, seemed to be to carry a miniaturized library of modern histories, ancient guidebooks, and travelers' accounts, printed on thin paper in a tiny typeface. For example, a set of the reports written by the prefects who were sent out by Napoleon after the Revolution to chart and describe the unknown provinces could be made to weigh less than a spare inner tube. And it meant that the more you read, the lighter your load becomes. Throw the pages away. It soon became apparent, however, that the terra incognita extended much further than I'd realized, and that far more time would have to be devoted to the more physically demanding task of sedentary research. I also wanted to write a book that would be about France as a whole and not just about Paris and the usual cast of important characters, although they're in it too, Napoleon, kings and queens, and so on. So this is how it begins. Actually, I do have my bicycle computer, so it's not entirely low-tech. One summer in the early 1740s, on the last day of his life, a young man from Paris became the first modern cartographer to see the mountain called Le Gerbier de Jean. This weird volcanic cone juts out of an empty landscape of pastures and ravines, blasted by a freezing wind called the Burle. 350 miles south of Paris, at a point on the map diametrically opposed to the capital, it stands on the watershed that divides the Atlantic from the Mediterranean. On its western slope, at a wooden trough where animals once came to drink, the River Loire begins its 640-mile journey, flowing north then west in a wide arc through the mudflats of Touraine to the east, through the mudflats of Touraine to the borders of Brittany and the Atlantic Ocean. 30 miles to the east, the busy River Rhone carried passengers and cargo down to the Mediterranean ports, but it would have taken more than 3 days to reach it across a sparsely populated chaos of ancient lava flows and gorges. If the traveller had scaled the peak of phonolithic rock, so called because of the xylophonic sound the stones make as they slide away under a climber's feet, he would have seen a magnificent panorama. To the east, the long white curtain of the Alps, from the Mont Blanc Massif to the bulk of Mont Ventoux, looking down over the plains of Provence. To the north, the wooded ridges of the Forez and the mists descending from the Jura to the plains beyond Lyon. To the west, the wild Cévennes, the Cantal Plateau, and the whole volcanic range of the upper Auvergne. It was like a geometer's dream, almost 1/13 of the land surface of France spread out like a map. From the summit, he could take in at a glance several small regions whose inhabitants barely knew of each other's existence. To walk in any direction for a day was to become incomprehensible, for the Mézenc range to which the mountain belonged was also a watershed of languages. The people who saw the sun set behind the Gerbier de Jean spoke one group of dialects. The people on the evening side spoke another. 40 miles to the north, the wine growers and silk weavers of the Lyonnais spoke a different language altogether, which had yet to be identified and named by scholars. Yet another language was spoken in the region the traveller had left the day before, and though his own mother tongue, French, was a dialect of that language, he would have found it hard to understand the peasants who saw him pass. The traveller in question, his name has not survived, belonged to an expedition that was to lay the groundwork for the first complete and reliable map of France. A team of young geometers had been assembled by the astronomer Jacques Cassini, instructed in the new science of cartography and equipped with specially made portable instruments. Cassini's father had studied the rings of Saturn and measured the size of the solar system. His map of the moon was more precise than many maps of France, which still contained several uncharted regions. Now, for the first time, France would be revealed in all its detail, as if from a great height above the earth. One part of the expedition had followed the River Loire as far as it could go. Roads and byways came and went with the seasons, and often passed through forests where no sightings could be taken. And so the river was the only certain guide to the interior. But south of Roanne, the Loire was a truculent stream that ran through narrow gorges. In parts it could hardly be followed, let alone used for transport. The vast plateau of the Massif Central was still the fortress it had been when the Arverni tribes held out against the Romans. Its rivers were unnavigable, and its links to the rest of France practically non-existent. The mail coach from Paris stopped at Clermont. A branch service struggled on as far as Le Puy, 2 days to the southeast. After Le Puy, there was nothing but mule tracks and open country. Asking for directions was a waste of time. Even a century later, few people could walk far from their place of birth without getting lost. By the time the geometer reached the foot of the Mézenc range, he was 2 days from the nearest road. The only noticeable settlement for miles around was a village of black lavastone hovels. According to one map, Les Étables should have been several miles to the southwest. In fact, it lay on a track that led towards the summit of the Mézenc. A small tower would make observations easy if the weather stayed fine, and there might be a French-speaking priest to identify remote hamlets and to give the names of woods and rivers. In any case, there was nowhere else to spend the night. The appearance of a stranger in the landscape was a notable event. To isolated villagers, a man in foreign clothes who pointed inexplicable instruments at barren rocks was up to no good. It had been noticed that after the appearance of one of these sorcerers, life became harder. Crops withered, animals went lame or died of disease, sheep were found on hillsides, torn apart by something more savage than a wolf. And for reasons that remained obscure, taxes increased. Even a century later, this was still a remote and dangerous part of France. A 19th century geographer recommended viewing the Mézenc region from a balloon, but he said only if the aeronaut can remain out of range of a rifle. In 1854, Murray's Handbook for Travellers in France warned tourists and amateur geologists who left the coach at Pradelles and struck out across country in search of wild and singular views not to expect a warm welcome. There is scarcely any accommodation on this route which can hardly be performed in a day, and the people are rude and forbidding. The handbook perhaps deliberately said nothing of les étables which lay on the route, nor did it mention the only occasion on which the village earned itself a place in history, a summer's day in the early 1740s when a young geometer on the Cassini expedition was hacked to death by the natives. On a more cheerful note, this is from the second part of the book, a chapter called The Avenues of Paris, which was the term applied to main roads because they were all supposed to serve the capital. And it gives some idea of what it was like traveling through France several decades after the period I've just mentioned. Except for fugitives, armies, and professional explorers, discovering France with or without a map was largely a matter of negotiating the network of roads, rivers, canals, and railways. From the distant present, this looks like a tale of steady progress. The speed of travel increased, people and merchandise moved about the country with growing ease, and social and economic change arrived by carriage and locomotive instead of on the back of a peddler or a mule. In the century that followed the revolution, the national road network almost doubled in size and the canal network increased fivefold. There were 14 miles of railway in 1828 and 22,000 in 1888. By the mid-19th century, a high-speed goods vehicle could cover 50 miles a day. Roads improved more quickly than at any time since the conquest of Gaul. Tracks that had wandered across country like a peasant returning from a feast were straightened, steep hills were flattened by hairpin bends, violent rivers were tamed or bypassed by imperturbable canals. One day, people would have to travel hundreds of miles to have the thrill of crossing a rickety plank bridge or seeing a carriage wheel skittering on the brink of a precipice. When the poet Alfred de Vigny watched the plume of a steam engine crossing a landscape at more than 10 miles an hour, he dreaded a future of endless, predictable change where everyone will run smoothly on a line and the world would be reduced to a monotonous blur. Farewell, slow journeys and distant sounds, the twists and turns of varied hills, the axles' delays, a friend encountered and the hours that slipped away, the hope of arriving late in a savage place. When Vigny wrote his poem in 1844, he was living in a Paris apartment, a few minutes' walk from several omnibus lines, 3 railway stations, and one of the busiest rivers in France. He had to be careful when crossing the road. The fact that he imagined himself in the same poem traveling with his mistress in a fragrant 4-wheeled shepherd's hut suggests that he had already lost sight of the world beyond the city. He lived in the metropolitan France, whose express roads and canals were universally admired as engineering marvels, but not in the other France, which was still recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire. The changes in French society described in the second part of this book were accelerated by the expanding infrastructure, but the experience of individuals was not arithmetically linked to increasing road length and diminishing journey times. Historical dramas usually show the most efficient technology of the period, healthy horses pulling shiny carriages on slightly bumpy roads. but not the most ordinary scenes of daily life. A cow munching peacefully on a main road near a city, two carriages stuck facing each other for hours on a road so narrow that the doors can hardly be opened, a horse with wooden planks placed under its belly being hoisted out of a mud hole, a farmer ploughing up the road to plant his buckwheat and potatoes. One of the best short guides to the experience of travelling in post-revolution France is a French-German phrase book published in 1799 by Caroline Stéphanie Félicité Ducré de Saint-Aubin, who's usually known as Madame de Genlis. Her pedagogical bent became apparent when, at the age of 6, she delivered a series of lectures to local peasants from the balcony of the family chateau near Autun. She later became a governess of the future King Louis-Philippe. She was an accomplished seamstress, surgeon, horse rider, harpist, and billiards player. Her historical novels are resolutely inaccurate, but her traveller's manual for French persons in Germany and German persons in France is a first-rate historical document. These phrases are taken from the sections on planning the journey, speaking to postilions during the journey, and talking at staging posts while the horses are being harnessed. They may sound slightly melodramatic, but similar phrases were used every day on the roads of France. Listen, postilion, if you drive at a good speed when the road is good, and slowly on corners and bridges or in towns and villages, then I shall give you a good tip. Otherwise, you shall have only the fare. Your carriage is heavy and overloaded. Not at all. I assure you that it is neither heavy nor overloaded. This horse is worthless. It is restive. It is skittish. I am decidedly loath to take it. Please give me a different one. And this phrase is probably of slightly more limited use. Can one place a harp in its carrying case on the luggage rack? What kind of road is it? It is very sandy. It is strewn with rocks. It is full of mountains, forests, and precipices. One must avoid passing through forests at dusk or at night. Postilion, I do not wish to leave the main road. I am absolutely set against it. But the sand is overtiring my horses. I do not wish to leave the main road, and you may not leave it without my permission, for the mail coach must follow the main road unless the passengers agree to leave it. Postilion, stop! The brakes must be attached. The descent is quite steep. I wish the brakes to be attached. Please ensure that the trunk is properly attached and that nothing has come undone. I believe that the wheels are on fire. Look and see. Postilion, a man has just climbed onto the back of the coach. Make him get down. Postilion, allow this poor man to climb onto the seat. He is so tired. Leave him alone. He is an old man. Climb up, my friend. Do not fall asleep on that seat, my man. You might fall off. Keep yourself awake. The kingpin has fallen out. The suspension has snapped. The coach has overturned. The horses have just collapsed. Is anyone hurt? No, thank God. The horse is badly wounded. It is dead. It's quite a large phrase book as well. Now, I was going to read from a chapter in the middle of the book, which is called The 60 Million Others, which is about animals, wild and domestic, which seem to me to have been neglected by historians because they can tell us quite a lot about the discovery of France. But there is a passage that I can't not read at a Google event, which is about remote communication and the dissemination of news. I'll abridge it slightly so there are slightly fewer figures. And this is from a chapter called Migrants and Commuters. Long before railways and the modern telegraph, news of important events could spread across the country at amazing speeds. The usual speed for an earth-shattering piece of news traveling over 100 miles, was between 4 and 7 miles an hour. The city of Le Havre heard about the fall of the Bastille, late afternoon, 14th of July, 1789, in the early hours of the 17th of July. In good conditions, Brest, at the tip of the Breton Peninsula, was 54 horse hours from Paris. Average speeds fell drastically on longer journeys, even on post roads, where horses and riders were relayed. Béziers, 520 miles on post roads from Paris, heard about the fall of the Bastille almost 7 days after the event, an average speed of less than 4 miles an hour. Despite this, there are several well-attested examples of news traveling at much higher speeds. The arrest of the royal family at Varennes when they were escaping from the revolution was known on the other side of France in Quimper at 7 in the morning on 24th of June, 1791. On post roads, Quimper was 540 miles from Varennes, which means that the news reached this remote and poorly served part of France at an average speed of almost 11 miles an hour, maintained for 2 days and 2 nights. This is faster even than the news of the Battle of Waterloo, brought by fleeing soldiers. At Villers-Cotterêts, the young Alexandre Dumas found their speed of 1.5 leagues an hour, which is just over 4 miles an hour, quite extraordinary. It seems, he wrote, that the messengers of misfortune have wings. The century's greatest expert on gossip and pre-industrial telecommunications, Honoré de Balzac, suggested that rumour could travel at about 9 miles an hour. The following passage refers to the sleepy provincial island in the heart of Paris, whose silence was preserved by toll bridges until the mid-19th century. Do not ask after the whereabouts of that mysterious telegraph, which transmits to all places at once, in the wink of an eye, a story, a scandal, or a piece of news. Ask not who operates the telegraph. An observer can merely note its effects. That telegraph is a social mystery. Some incredible examples can be cited. One will suffice. The murder of the Duc de Berry, who was struck down at the Opéra, was reported 10 minutes after the crime in the depths of the Ile Saint-Louis. These speeds were effectively unattainable by conventional transport over long distances. Until the mid-19th century, long-distance speeds over 10 miles an hour usually indicate some form of remote transmission, such as the pigeons that were used by a few stock market speculators to transmit share prices, or the stationary messengers who shouted the news of Julius Caesar's victory at Canarbon, Orléans, all the way to the land of the Arverni, 150 miles away, a speed in excess of 12 miles an hour. An experiment conducted in the 19th century showed that using this method, only 352 people were needed to transmit a message from Orléans to the frontiers of the Auvergne. With an inexhaustible supply of data, logical explanations could be found for exceptional speeds. To bring the news of the king's arrest at Quimper, a fast rider must have set off from Paris as soon as word came from Varennes. He must have ridden through the night twice or been relayed by other night riders. The roads, for once, were presumably all passable and all the bridges intact. Relay horses, other than the small Breton breeds, must have been available, fed and harnessed at every stage. This is not beyond the bounds of possibility. The truly remarkable thing about the dissemination of news is its unpredictability and its apparent independence from known transport networks. In 1932, Georges Lefebvre studied the spread of the so-called Great Fear that gripped 2/3 of the country in July and August 1789. The revolution sparked rumours in half a dozen places of invading foreign troops and bandits paid by vengeful aristocrats to destroy the harvest. It was the sort of panic that could and did make a rational person mistake a herd of cows for a marauding gang of cutthroats. When Georges Lefebvre charted the course of each rumour, he exposed the previously unsuspected arteries of a gigantic ant's nest. Maps of the Great Fear seemed to show a communication system that was strangely unreliant on any infrastructure. Paris played no role in the rumour network, nor did natural routes like the valleys of the Rhône and the Garonne. Higher ground slowed the rumours but did not stop them. The lofty Massif Central, which was bypassed by travelling apprentices, kings and theatre companies on tour, Napoleon Bonaparte, several epidemics, and until 1951, the Tour de France, was infiltrated from the north, the east, and the west. And I'm tempted to leave the explanation to some other time, so I can just fit in something about cycling. But perhaps I'll just read the first part of it. This is about the discovery made by Napoleon's statisticians when they first went out to see what natural resources the country had. They discovered that in one département, Finistère, almost 1/5 of the total surface was taken up by roads and byways. Ruts, paths, cartways, and great trampled swathes of land that were lost to agriculture and often unusable even as tracks. Paradoxically, this inaccessible part of France was riddled with routes. And further studies confirmed the incredible figures. Finistère was an extreme case, but many other départements turned out to be crazed with tiny roads. The effect can still be pictured in some parts of France. So many different roads once ran from Beauvais to Amiens that 6 of them still exist, all more or less the same length, about 39 miles, and sometimes close enough for a person on one road to wave to someone on the other. The huge discrepancy between the trifling amount of traffic on main roads and the quantities of goods delivered to markets and ports suggests that 3/4 of all trade in the early 19th century passed through this all-encompassing web. This was the system of fragile capillaries that carried the rumours and news. Many of these paths had no visible existence, except even to a person standing on one. This labyrinth is the reason why the towns and villages of France were both cut off and connected. Wares and produce travelled through the system of tracks and tiny roads by something akin to Brownian motion, changing hands gradually over great distances. When the main roads were improved and railways were built, trade was drained from the capillary network, links were broken, and a large part of the population suddenly found itself more isolated than before. Many regions today are experiencing the same effect because of the TGV railway system. I'll just finish with a brief section on bicycles. Although there is quite a lot about bicycles in other parts of the book. This is about the effect of the bicycle on daily life, which is now drastically underestimated by many historians who tend to see the bicycle as an instrument of self-inflicted torture. And I apologize to any bicyclists here, but this seemed worth saying at this point in the book. Simple truths have been forgotten. As almost everyone knew 100 years ago, the secret of riding a bicycle as an adult is to pedal just hard enough to keep the machine upright, then to increase the speed very gradually, but without becoming too breathless to hold a conversation or to hum a tune. In this way, with a regular intake of water and food, an uncompetitive, moderately fit person can cycle up an Alp or a Pyrenees with luggage on a stern but steady gradient engineered for an 18th century mule. They discovered in the 18th century that a fully laden mule can manage about 8% or 1 in 12. It's very unusual even now to find a road steeper than that in France. Descending is more difficult, but statistically much safer to all concerned than in a car. To generations unspoiled by automation, 100-mile bike rides were quite routine. When the teacher from Chartres, and this is a man who went on a cycling holiday at the end of the 19th century, spent 2 weeks riding 65 hilly miles a day. When the teacher from Chartres set off on his 1,000-mile holiday in 1895, bone shakers were already a distant memory. His machine was identical in most respects to the modern bicycle. It had ball bearings and pneumatic tires. Many velocipedes were lighter and more reliable than the energy-sapping machines that can be seen on city streets today. There were bicycles that folded up into a suitcase and bicycles that pumped up their own tires. The derailleur, which made it possible to change gear without removing the back wheel, was introduced in 1912. Brakes, however, once again, were still in their infancy. Many cyclists recommended tying a heavy branch to the seat post before beginning a descent. But only, said one of them, in the absence of dust, mud, sudden turns, and especially forest guards, who may refuse to believe that one has brought one's own branch from Paris. As soon as second-hand bicycles and cheap imitations of the well-known models became available, millions of people were liberated from their close horizons by a mechanical horse that could be given fresh limbs and reincarnated by the local blacksmith. A boy with a bicycle could leave his pays in search of a job or a bride and be back in time for dinner, which is why the bicycle has been credited with increasing the average height of the French population by reducing the number of marriages between blood relations. It was used by farm workers, urban commuters, postmen, village priests, gendarmes, and the French army, which, like many other European nations, had several battalions of cycling cavalry. Before the First World War, at least 4 million bicycles were owned in France, which represents one bicycle for every 10 people. 3.5 million were declared for tax, but many more feedless horses must have been hidden in stables. It was now possible to travel long distances at an invigorating speed with the sort of panoramic view over the hedgerows previously enjoyed only by travellers perched on the roof of the long-distance coach. Bicycles could be hired in most towns and taken on trains for less than a franc. The railway companies accepted responsibility for any damage. There were special maps for cyclists showing steep hills, danger spots, paved and tarmac sections, and separate bicycle paths in towns. In her European Travel for Women, 1900, Mary Cadwallader Jones recommended the bicycle as a means of discovering France. Her only word of caution concerned the law on keeping to the right. You cannot always be sure. There are right and left-handed cities and districts, so you must always keep your eyes open if you are bicycling. Thank you. I'm happy to attempt an answer to any questions you might have. Well, they might be answered in the book, in any case. Yes?
When was it that essentially all the French actually spoke the same language?
When was
when
it
did
that
it- yes,
they spoke
yeah.
the same language? Very, very recently. There are still in some parts of France, you find people who are more comfortable speaking the local dialect or language. And French itself, one of the nice things about being a foreigner speaking French is that if you've learnt it at school and college, you're very often complimented on your good French, because since it's in some ways an artificial language created by the French Academy, no one speaks perfect French except foreigners. And so 100 years ago, more than half the country didn't speak French. This is what they discovered at the time of the revolution, when they started sending decrees out, because it was supposed to be a democracy. They realized that most of the country couldn't understand them, and that includes the literate people. So the first person to find out that French was a comparatively unusual language in France was a member of the revolutionary government who sent out a questionnaire to all the different départements. And when they replied, 3 or 4 years later, he realized that French was a minority language.
I already kind of asked this a little bit earlier, but I'd repeat it for folks in the room. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the experience that you had with actually cycling, putting together all of those trips and how that went.
Yeah. Well, I should say, first of all, it's very easy cycling in France because there's a general feeling that this is the way you should see the country. either cycling or walking. And you can turn up at quite a nice hotel that looks clean and genteel, covered in mud and sweat, and you'll be treated like royalty and given the best table in the restaurant, which is quite nice after you've spent a day on the road with cars. But it was really, it's thanks to my wife, who's a librarian. She's very good at packing, and there was a lot of comparative weighing of clothes items before we sent off, and it is incredible how much weight you can save. But my biggest recommendation would be to have your own bicycle made, which is usually, if you can find a good bike workshop, is usually cheaper than helping to pay the overheads of a well-known bike company. And it means you have a bicycle that fits you perfectly. And even if you're not very fit, you will be about 25% fitter, in effect, when you get on a bicycle that fits your body. And that is one of the nice things about cycling anywhere, I think, is that even though it doesn't really take much effort, you get a tremendous amount of credit for covering what are really fairly piffling distances. And usually what happens in France is they'll say, how far have you come? And you say 80 kilometers. And they'll say 80 kilometers. And then they look at my wife and say, poor madame. So they would assume it's my idea. So I'd recommend it as a holiday to anyone who knows how to ride a bike. There is also a point about the gradients on mountains being engineered for mules, which is very helpful. And it kind of puts the Tour de France in perspective, because even though it is an amazing feat, doing that for 3 weeks, the mountains aren't, there are parts of the Rockies that are definitely a lot steeper. And mountains in Wales and Scotland tend to be built like step pyramids. They're flat and then they shoot up. So you just get into a rhythm. And
so having seen 14,000 miles of the country, is there a particular region that you would want to go back to over and over again, a favorite region?
That's very difficult to say. It's, I suppose, Provence, because the food and there's great diversity of terrain. The food is important. There's nothing worse than cycling all day and then finding a plate of steak frites and limp lettuce that's been galvanized with industrial oil. But I think Provence, anywhere the Romans were, is worth going to. And it's called Provence because it was the Roman province in Gaul. So I think that's probably the best place. If you're cycling, mountains are definitely better than flatlands because you never have much problem with the wind. But I think this is something that's known to all bicyclists and not known to people who don't cycle. That really the worst days you can spend on a bicycle are in the flat country, if you're against the wind, of course.
So I had a question from Mountain View. Someone was curious to know what you were working on right now.
Ah, that's nice. I'm working on a book on Paris. It'll be a kind of... I thought I wanted to write a history of Paris. But in some ways, it's easier to write the history of a whole country than it is to write the history of a city, because with a city, you have a vision of completeness. You can list all the streets, you could list all the different quartiers, but of course you can't, and it becomes very tedious. And at the same time, there were several stories, true stories, that I wanted to write up. And then it occurred to me that I'd read several histories of Paris, and all I remembered, really, were stories, like Quasimodo or the royal family escaping from Paris and so on. So it's history of Paris focused on particular dramas. I think it'll be called Parisians. That's a few years off.
Hi. In your book, you have a chapter about colonization. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And in particular, during your trip, which region in particular did you talk a little bit more about that? Which one were the one that you think had the most impact?
Yeah, colonization was, I used it partly in the political sense, but mostly in the sense of turning wasteland into profitable agricultural land. And what happened in France is the two most spectacular examples are in the southwest, in the Landes, and in the east, in the Alps. And what happened in the Landes is when you go there now, it's a huge artificial pine forest. It's the biggest artificial forest in Western Europe. It takes about 2.5 days to cycle from one end of the forest to the other. And 100 years ago, there was no forest at all. It was just sandy scrub that was grazed by a few sheep. There was a very small population, and that's now all gone. There isn't a single patch of it that remains. There are just a few clearings in the forest. And that was imposed on the region by the government in France. That was a deliberate planting of that whole area. In the east, there was a lot of forestation as well, but that was partly because the local people had cut down so many trees that there was no protection anymore from avalanches, and the mountains were just washed away, really. There were a few villages that managed to cling on until quite late into the 1920s, and eventually they had to be moved. So it was political colonization, but it was also to give the idea that the land has changed enormously, as much as the parts of the United States did, and that this is quite recent. So most of what we now think of as typical French landscapes are less than a century old. Actually, the Landes is also a good place to go if you're cycling as well, because there are bicycle paths all the way through, which were built by the Nazis in the Second World War when they were defending the Atlantic coast. They used bicycle messengers all the way up the Atlantic when they thought the invasion was going to come from that side. And the paths are still there. So it's about the only good thing they did in France.
So I have a question from Santa Monica. Could you talk a bit more about the state of indigenous languages and separatist movements in France today, such as in the Britons?
Yeah. The interesting thing about separatist movements, there's separatist movement in Brittany, the Basque Country, which is obviously more active in Spain, where it has a terrorist branch. Also in the Jura in the east, Alsace-Lorraine, lots of different regions. Those regionalist movements are also quite recent. And most people who lived, or everyone who lived in Brittany, first acquired a sense of being French before they acquired a sense of being Breton, because their loyalties were far more local before they knew that they belonged to a nation called France. It's a difficult subject to talk about in France because it tends to be associated with nostalgia and various unrealistic perceptions of the past. So that's and of course it now has a political dimension. So I think rather than reflecting a past when these regions were virtually autonomous, it reflects irritation with a constant feature of modern French history, which is centralization and the predominant role of Paris and what's seen as its unfair influence over the rest of the country. And that's still going on today. In fact, it's centralized really just on central Paris, because as you've probably seen in the Times today, the riots in the suburbs are continuing, but they aren't part of Paris. They're part of the outer world. And once you're beyond the outer boulevards, that's a different part of France. And that's still a problem in French policy towards underfunded regions like the suburbs of the big cities. I mean, you could see that as a kind of independence movement too, because the riots are directed against the forces of law and order. In fact, you could also talk about, there is a kind of, it's not colonization, but there is a kind of colonial attitude on the part of the forces of law and order towards those areas. But that's a different topic.
So in your introduction, you mentioned the tire shredding suburbs of Paris. So
Yeah.
what does it take to bike in and around Paris? I've also heard about the crazy drivers in Paris itself. Is it even possible to cycle in Paris, and what does it take to cycle around Paris?
Yeah, good question. Well, there was recently there's been a mayor of Paris who was very keen on cycling, and he's put in a lot of bike paths and bike lanes. So it's become a lot easier than it was before. It's still quite difficult because you'd be going along a bike lane, suddenly a market sprung up. But it means there are far more people cycling. And of course, the more people are cycling, the safer it becomes for cyclists. So it's a really good place to cycle. I have noticed that people do, in Britain anyway, complain about French drivers, but cyclists don't usually complain about French drivers. And it's not just that there's a different kind of etiquette on the road. It's also that they're just more aware of what cycling is. So in Britain, if you're going along the road and there's a car waiting to pull out, it'll pull out in front of you because they'll assume you're going about 2 miles an hour. And in France, it's quite the opposite. It's sometimes a bit embarrassing. If you're cycling along, they'll assume you're going about 15 miles an hour. And they have to wait there sometimes quite a while before you get there. But and Paris is a fantastic city to cycle in. It's a really good way to see the city.
I have a question about the view of the French toward the U.S. because our relations have deteriorated in the past few years, thanks to our administration. When I go to Paris and talking to random Parisians, they'll say, I like the American people a lot. I don't like your government. So outside of Paris and the other regions, what's the sentiment that you have felt?
It's very difficult to generalize. I mean, as you say, it is an attitude towards American policies. I mean, it's not, there isn't, people understand, especially in France, that the population is not necessarily represented by the foreign policy of its government, even if foreign policy is determined by domestic policy. And my wife's never, people say, where are you from? Say Britain, she'll say America. No one really says anything stupid. They quite often they try out bits of American if they're old enough that they learned at the end of the Second World War. I mean, the thing that occurs to me, which still strikes me now, was that when 9/11 happened, we were in quite a rural part of France in the southeast, near the Alps, and we hadn't seen the news. And we went into a restaurant in the hotel we were staying at, and it was deserted. We were the only people in it, and they knew we were British and American. And we ate our meal, and they served it, and they didn't want to spoil the meal. And it was only the next morning when we went down, she brought out the local paper and said, "Have you seen this?" And she, she's an intelligent person, but it was so remote to her. She showed us the picture that showed plumes of smoke covering the whole of Manhattan. And she said in French, "They've blown up Manhattan." So, I think it's that when people talk about American policy, they're thinking about just French domestic policy. But there was also a thing about, didn't this start in the Iraq War? Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, I think they knew about that. And then that's a very complex topic, isn't it? But generally, it's very, very positive. any American individual, as you know. I mean, it's just. I think there's much more. Racism is much more influential in French society than nationalism, patriotism. Okay. Thank you very much.